So really quick, I just want you to think for a moment in your brain. Have you had that student who just is constantly falling behind whenever there's a writing assignment, or will write very little, or, so I'm starting to see head nods, or seems to push it all off to the last minute, like intense procrastination? Everyone experienced that student at least once in their teaching career. I feel like we all have. For me, one of my struggles was once I assigned something, how do I make sure that students are getting caught up and staying with the group? Because as soon as I feel like I had assigned writing, and I feel like I had some kids who were done, and some kids who were barely, like they just weren't getting anything on a page. And I would be like, well, they're just not motivated, or they just are lacking the skills. But then when I started doing the research, I found out that a lot of that can actually be caused by writing anxiety, which is true anxiety about writing in general. Anxiety a lot spawns from this sense of needing control and needing to make sure that you feel confident in being able to do something. And if you can't, your brain can tend to spiral into all the possible consequences of the negative repercussions of you not being able to perform well. There's also communication anxiety, which is more social interaction, but that can also stem from just writing. And so there's been a lot of research on writing anxiety, which basically just says that it's characterized as apprehension to doing anything that involves writing. And it's a fear of an undesirable outcome or negative consequences that could result specifically from writing. There are a lot of different tools out there that are used to see how students might interact with writing, whether they feel confident about that or whether they are anxious about that. And so in the classroom, a lot of times writing anxiety can be misinterpreted as just a lack of motivation, when really there is a lot more underneath that, and teachers can help support students through that. A lot of that can also present as avoiding classes or situations that involve writing, really negative talk for self-writing. I know I had that student this year who's just like, I'm just not good at this, or I'm going to fail anyways, why do I have to write it? Or this just isn't for me. And a lot of that, like she would initially put herself down so that when she did something, it's almost like setting the bar low so that if you do fail, at least the bar was low for yourself. Consistently failing to turn in assignments, I feel like we've all probably had that student at one point or another. And then the extreme end of that would be not attending class when writing is required. To just talk about the interpretations of this, some people who do research on writing anxiety believe that it's more, that they believe in a deficit model, that the student is lacking the skills in order to be successful in writing, and so that causes their anxiety when it comes to writing. Or there's also the, the interference model. This is where anxiety about writing actually interferes with the cognitive processes related to retrieving information and being able to write. So the anxiety causes more anxiety, and that's debated constantly. But one thing that does, regardless of the model that you use to interpret writing anxiety, you can easily see how English language learners, foreign language learners, students who read and write below grade level, and perfectionists are more prone to writing anxiety. And the perfectionist piece was something that I was really interested in. I was like, oh, you're a perfectionist or whatever, but there's actually this whole field of study on perfectionism, which maybe I was very naive to think about, but there's a whole field of study on perfectionism and how it can be related to writing anxiety, specifically related to significant others, they call them, so people who a perfectionist would place stock in their opinion. So being the teacher, you are often that significant other, and another student that I've always had is like, well, what should I write, or what do you want me to write? And I really just want them to write. But if I don't tell them, it suddenly becomes this point of incredible anxiety where they don't trust themselves, or setting that really high expectation that's A, an undesirable expectation, and B, unattainable. So there's the background. I promise I'll just stop shouting at you in a moment. So here are kind of the 4 areas where a lot of research has linked, and these are the 4 areas that in some ways surprised me, but also reading these, I got very frustrated going through some of the research for my inquiry because I was finding that there was all this research and then no, here's what to do. There was no support, and that was so frustrating to me. Bailey and I had talked before about, like, theory is great and all, it's good to know the research, but what do I do? Like, what can I take into my classroom now? And so that's what I wanted to focus on for my inquiry, and I had just a bullet point list that we'll go over in a moment. But the main complaints that students were feeling were that writing is not a habit that they do, and so they're lacking the skill of just writing constantly or having confidence in their writing, or they would get very anxious when writing was used as an assessment, which I know is something that I did this past year. It was something that we used as an assessment after reading a book or after completing addition, they believed that they lacked the skills necessary to even organize ideas or gather information or combine ideas to really create the writing that I was asking them to do. Some anxieties came from the teacher, either not giving feedback, not positively encouraging writing, so again, writing being a negative experience, or that the teacher themselves showed apprehension towards writing. This is something that I know I have fallen victim to, and even in Wyoming Writing Project, a lot of times I'd be like, I'm not a writer, I don't know how to do this, or I wouldn't want to share, and it did put me in the place of my students again and remind me how vulnerable that is, but also gave me the confidence to now model that growth for my students, which I'm thankful for. The last one is that it's not meaningful to students, that they're like, well, why do I have to do this anyways? And what you're trying to ask them to do is not lining up with what they feel like they will be doing later on, or it's not interesting to them. So therefore, I made my list of strategies because there were none anywhere that I looked. And they really just focused on addressing these 4 areas. So that's kind of how I broke them down. So for this idea of students making it a habit for them, and I pulled a lot of this from you all in Writing Project, but one of the things that I'm going to focus on in my classroom this coming year is providing those low-stakes writing opportunities so that students get to play with their writing and really form writing as just that habit, whether that's just a sentence a day or whether that is more long, drawn-out assignments. I want that to be accessible to students. I'm going to do this by this writing in and out of the day, like we've done in Writing Project, but I'm going to modify it a little bit and probably do writing in and out of the week, so that every week they come into class, they know that we're writing, and it sets the mood for my classes as a reading and writing scenario for them, but also writing out of the week. Then on Fridays they can have that time to just play write, because that's what I want them to be able to do. I also linked a lot of different books that we've talked about or that I've had in my own personal collection. I also was going through my classroom the other day and just found a bunch of these little writing activities. I have tons of these books, and they sat on my shelf and never used them. So I know that there's the resources out there that I have to sit every day and come up with some brilliant idea, because people have given me brilliant ideas in these books to do writing in and out of the day or in and out of the week or whatever that might look like. I also want to use writer's notebooks. We've heard a lot about blogs and things like that. There's so many avenues for students to be able to do that playwriting. And then one thing that we did in the junior high that was actually really fun, I'm not a huge fan of it, but it was a lot of fun for my students. It's called Giggles in the Middle. It's by Jane Keister. Has anyone heard of that? Okay, one person. Good. So it's like a story, and the students get 1 to 2 sentences. We did it every day. So it was like a 10-minute warm-up, 1 to 2 sentences every day, and eventually they write it in their notebook, and it told a story. But in the 2 sentences that they get, there were tons of errors, whether that was indentation or quotation marks or commas or a period at the end. And in doing that, I tell my students, okay, there are 12 mistakes. See if you can find all 12. And it turned into a game, which instead of doing correct all, because I hate correct all, because I remember doing them when I was in elementary school, and it killed grammar for me. Even though this is grammar practice, it gave them the skills to do capitalization and punctuation and things like that, but it turned it into a game, like I said. 8 mistakes, 15 mistakes, and they try to compare and see how many they could find, and it helps them do the editing so that when it came to their own writing, they're like, oh yeah, I need capitals at the beginning of a sentence, which was fun for students to see. In terms of teaching skills, I wanted to make sure that I was meeting the needs of my students, and so whether that was in a whole class mini lesson or that was small groups that I was working with, students that I identified, okay, in your writing, here's a pattern that I'm seeing, let me work with you all. Or talking about just individual conferencing, and I have a bunch of resources that are talking about student-led conferencing and things like that that I'm excited to look into, because I think that's one way that I can address individually instead of hounding the whole class on, we put a period at the end of a sentence. That way the student can kind of have that self-discovery and make sure that they're moving forward and can have that ownership of their own writing and that own growth. And so there's a bunch of text on here that I've used. Mechanically inclined and writing with mentors are the 2 right now, and right beside them, that I am so excited to use. Mechanically inclined, sits on the top of my bookshelf. It doesn't actually get shelved ever because I'm constantly pulling it out and using it for mentors and ideas and things like that. Writing with Mentors was what we used in Wyoming Writing Project. That was a book that we read, and it's awesome. It gave me a lot of those practical things that I can incorporate in my classroom. And then for student-led conferencing, I have a little bit more reading to do. I also want to talk about graphic organizers and outlines. strategy doesn't mean that they're going to use it, and it's not that they don't acknowledge that that strategy exists or that graphic organizer exists. They might not know how to access it. And so that being said, I have learned from this past year of teaching, instead of just slapping a graphic organizer and outline down in front of my students and saying, here, outline your paper, I'm realizing now why that was so ineffective, which sounds very silly from my perspective, but making sure that I'm teaching students how to use those tools and also providing the choice. If a word map works better for you than an outline that I would probably use, choose that. Great, let me help you work through that. So I want to make sure I'm giving that choice to my students when I'm teaching them these skills. And then some other things that I highlighted, like I said, I was very anxious coming into Wyoming Writing Project for a lot of these things, and it's taught me a lot about how I can be a better writer for my students. So being a teacher writer and writing alongside my students, also making sure that I am owning myself as a writer, which we've talked before how awkward it can be to say, like, I'm a writer, because I don't feel like a writer. I feel like I'm such an imposter when I say I'm a writer because I'm not published. But I am a writer because I'm doing writing, and I want to make sure that my students identify as writers as well, because there is a lot of ownership in that. Also, I really want to hold a writing marathon. Writing marathons are a super fun way to just get students writing. And so I'm excited to show them that you can play and write in all these different places, not just in a classroom. I really want to make sure that writing extends beyond my classroom. I also want to connect with published authors to show them that, yes, I might say I'm a writer, but like these are real writers. And so I want them to see that writing does go outside of my classroom and it can have a purpose besides the argumentative essay I'm asking them to write. I also want to do real life writing with my students and show them, like, here's how we write an email, here's how we address a letter, here's how we do these things, not to dumb it down and minimize the skills that they might already have, but to hone those skills to make sure that they do see the purpose of writing beyond the essay. They might have to write a toast someday, they might have to write a query letter. I didn't even know how to write a query letter until I was reading it in a book, or a resume, and that those mentor texts are available, and I'm available to help them do that real life writing as well. And then this is just something that I would encourage all teachers to do, is to seek out the professional development to help you become a stronger writer, and not just a plug for like Wyoming Writing Project. That all aside, this has really helped me come away with skills that I feel like I can instill in my classroom now, and I wish it was like later so I could go in my classroom on Monday and do these things. I'm scared I'm going to lose them. But seeking out that professional development has been so rewarding for me as a brand new teacher. And so I hope that I will continue to do that as I move through my career, because I think that there's so much to be learned that ultimately, if I can become a better teacher, it's something that I can help my students become better writers with. One thing that I learned, I just went to a conference in Atlanta, and one of the keynote speakers there talked about those really tough questions you need to ask yourself as teachers, and one of the ones that he highlighted that has really stuck with me is asking yourself, are my students at an advantage because I am their teacher? And that, I don't know why that has stuck with me so much, but I want to answer yes. I want to say, because I have done the work that I have done, not that I'm done learning, but I want to make sure that because my students sit in those chairs and I am their teacher, I've got this, and I'm here to support them in what they need, and they will become better writers because of what I can bring to the table. That's not to say that I know everything. I don't mean for that to sound conceited at all, but I want that answer to be yes. I want to make sure that my students can do this because I am modeling being a teacher writer for them. And then lastly, creating choice in assignments. And we've all probably heard this several times, so making sure that you're providing students the opportunity to seek out writing that is real to them. So looking into student-friendly publications, using mentor texts so that students can see a wide variety of writing and pick what fits their style or picks their voice. I know this past year I would give my students one mentor text and be like, analyze this. And then they'd be like, okay, we did that. Now how do I use it? And I'd say, well, do you have your mentor text? No, I threw it away. It's like, what? And I thought that I was like so offended because I thought that I chose the best mentor text, when really that test had nothing, it didn't apply to them. Well, some students used it, others were like, this isn't how I write, this isn't what I wanted to do. So that was a huge light bulb moment for me of making sure that I'm not just providing one mentor text, that I'm providing a variety of writing for students to identify with, because I know how I write is different from how Sarah writes, it's different from how Bailey writes, so I want to make sure that I'm providing that opportunity to my students as well. I also looked at, speaking of providing different writing examples to students, providing different writing opportunities for students. Beyond the 5-paragraph essay is a book that I had to read in college, and it didn't click until now after a year of teaching. But it's a really great book about expanding, especially we talked a lot about, in some of our standardized tests in general, that there are a lot of other options and ways for students to write. And so how do we open those up? Can you do a critical review rather than as a literary analysis of a book rather than just a 5-paragraph essay, really making sure that we provide that choice. And then networking. I'm now on Twitter, and I gave everyone so much flack for getting on Twitter because I was not about it, and it's actually been really cool. I'm kind of a nerd about it because I have like all these authors and like other professional people who work in classroom discipline or writing or reading, and they have helped me come up with even more ideas, or they're the ones finding the mentor texts or offering other books, and that has been really cool for me as a first-year teacher who has nothing, but I also have nothing to lose, so I'm willing to try anything that anyone provides to me. That has been really fun for me as well, and you've all heard about the blogs that other teachers are doing, and I'm excited to take a lot of this into my department and say, hey, what do you think about this? Would you be willing to try this with me, or do you see a better way to do it? That I'm really excited for. The last thing I'll say that's not on here, and then we can chat and I can answer questions. I'm not an expert, I'm just starting this, but I feel very excited about it because it's something I've seen in my classroom. But one of the things that I forgot to mention on here is making sure that you are creating that environment in your classroom that helps students relax, not only playing with writing, but also making sure that they feel comfortable in your classroom. One of the things is calming down the amygdala, which is part of the brain that searches for threats. Your brain is always doing two things. One, searching for threat, and two, seeking meaning. And so it makes a lot of sense in our classroom. Then, for one, if you're searching for threats, if that is triggered, then your brain goes into flight, fight, or freeze. And so if you are constantly living in that state in a classroom, especially if you have writing anxiety, it's going to create a huge wall for you to overcome when it comes to just getting something down on a piece of paper. It's also constantly searching for meaning, which is why many of you probably, up until I say this, have not felt your butt against the chair. You're feeling it now because I just gave it meaning. You can feel those like nerves sending that to your brain. However, because that usually doesn't have meaning, when you sit in a chair, a few seconds after you sit in that chair, your brain lets it go because it no longer has meaning. In the same way in our classrooms, I'm asking students to write an argumentative piece. If it doesn't have meaning and it's not relevant to them, then it's going to just go in their brain for the limited time that we do it, and then they're not going to retain those skills. In the same way, creating positive emotions surrounding writing is something that seems very silly, and I'm going to ask you to do it in a moment, but has worked wonders in my classroom. And when I did the research, I found out that it wasn't as insane as people told me it was, and that there's actually a lot of research that backs it helping calm your amygdala. So one thing that I do in my classroom that I saw at a conference and then did more research on was like, oh, I'm not crazy, okay. I wanted to build community. I want to make sure that students were talking to one another. And so one thing that I would do when I would have them pair up to share a piece of writing, I would say, all right, when you find that partner, say, what's good, partner? And until I hear that, you may not talk. And so they had to find that person. It was so awkward, and I'd say, that's okay, fake it till you make it. And they would do it, and they'd look at each other and say, what's good, partner? But then at least they initiated a conversation, and then they could start talking in a lot of ways, or they'd giggle about it, or I'd come up with something and be like, hey, nice kicks, and like they'd have to talk about their shoes for a second, and then talk about their writing. A lot of times that made them start giggling, or it would make them start to interact in a way that might have been uncomfortable, but started to release those chemicals in your brain that tell you, okay, this is safe, this is good, you're laughing, that's a good sign. And then it again, calms that amygdala, gets rid of the threat, or at least reduces the threat, so that you're creating a more positive experience around writing. Another thing that I've had them do is I would just say, turn to your partner. So I'm going to ask you to find someone and actually look at them. Find that someone. Look at them. And I want you to smile the biggest smile you possibly can while staring at that person. Stare at them. Make eye contact. Smile the biggest smile you can muster. Now smile a little bit more. Okay. Now doing that, you can stop now, but in doing that, even after I said now stop, all of you had a smile still on your face. And a lot of the research suggests that even if it's forced, even if it's a fake emotion, it still activates that part of your brain that tells you that it's a real emotion. So even faking an emotion can also lead to you having a more positive experience with that. Again, it sounds really silly, but I've tried these things with 6th graders, and they were like, oh, Miss Wood, this is stupid. And I'd be like, I don't care. Just try it. And they did, and I had students giggling, and I had students laughing where they were looking for that next phrase instead of what's good, partner. I would be like, I'm so glad you're here today, and they had to smile that big smile and muster as much confidence as they could to share that interaction. Again, I know it sounds silly, but once it was instilled in the classroom, the students students looked forward to it. Or if I forgot to be like, so what are we going to say? Like, oh yeah, okay. But again, calming the amygdala and making things surrounding writing a positive experience, even if the writing isn't positive itself, for them to be able to open up and share that was cool to see in my classroom, and I'm excited to make that more of a classroom norm in the coming year. So those are kind of the things that I have learned, and I wanted to do the how-to. And we've talked about a lot of these how-tos before, but I wanted them to be linked to the specific areas of addressing writing anxiety in the classroom that I wasn't able to find. And I'm going to work on a questionnaire that can be used that's more friendly than the higher ed questionnaires that I've been seeing that are like from 1975, or the really beginning writing questionnaires that people give very beginner writers. I want to create something that can be a little bit more informational for the everyday teacher to use in their classroom to see how their students feel about writing. And I'm hoping that by the end of this, I can gather some of the information. Hopefully some of this will actually be linked to data proving that it does help students feel a little bit better about writing. That being said, I realize I talked way longer than I thought I was going to. What questions do you have? Or comments or things that you would add to the list that you use in your own classroom? Because I would love to add those.
I've noticed that, like just even asking the kids to do, you want to call it free write or fun writing or whatever you want to do, just the stamina of like they don't have, so just building up on, okay, we're just going to start out right for a minute today, and then building up on that to where, they can just rewrite for the 15 minutes or whatever, but they don't even have that stamina to write, let alone try to write and think about what to write, make sure it's perfect, and just, all of those things that go with it. So I really noticed that, like building up the stamina first, just even for them to be able to write without worrying about anything else was hard.
I like that idea that they brought up about students feeling like it wasn't a habit, because I know when I was student teaching, I had a student who would just sit there and be like, I don't know what to say. And even if I was like, well, why don't you just like get it down? Like it can suck. That's okay. Just get something down on the paper. And even that he felt like he couldn't do. So I'm with you there. Building up that stamina is so important. That's why making it a habit and making it something that is normal, I guess, in the classroom is something that I look forward to doing with my students this year for sure.
And I'm sure we've all had that student that I don't know what's right. I'm just like, write that then. I don't know what's right. I don't know what's right. I don't know what's right. Just as long as you are writing something, and they're like, oh, this is stuff. And I said, but eventually something else will come out. And so after about 4 times of I don't know what's right, I don't know what's right, then you would get, well, this is done. But that's like, it was something different than, something just bring up for a minute. Okay. So
That's great.
I think that this tells me, as I work with really young children, because I struggled writing when I was young. But I think it's because I don't think we think young children can write. And so we don't tell them and make them really aware that they are anything that they want to be. So when I see young families with young children really expressing that idea of anything you put on paper is, something that's written, no matter what it is. I mean, children write in representation with pictures and things like that first. So I think when you're talking about 6th graders and you hear they're really struggling with this, I wonder how much writing experience they had even when they were very young. So I think if I had any of you guys as teachers when I was young, I would be a much better writer than I am. I think times have just changed. And so the younger children really learn to put things on paper, no matter what it is. That's just how it goes. And we have so much anxiety. But it's true. Writing is tough.
I love hearing from the early childhood perspective, because this is like coming from a middle school, high school perspective. That's very interesting to think about, because you're right. If we can instill those skills in students, imagine how much more they would be able to do, or at least feel as open to them as writers later on.
Writing is very subjective, and anything subjective is personal. And so to really open up and do all of those things is really difficult. But if you can get a kid when they're young and they're free and easy and thinking it's great, they're going to fare better.
That's another thing I forgot to mention is that within writing anxiety, just because a student, it might not be across all genres of writing. Tiffany tells the story about a student she had who would write like these giant manuscripts for books, and she identified as a writer, but then when she was asked to do more academic writing, she would freeze, and she would have struggle with that a lot because it did cause her a lot of anxiety. And I'm not saying that every student who has struggles writing has anxiety, but as we probably all attest to, when you're asked to share a piece of writing or you're asked to write something on the spot, you do feel that sense of anxiety, like you're not keeping up, or you should be sharing something, you don't feel like sharing, and so it can be very anxiety-inducing. So writing anxiety doesn't have to go across all genres of writing. It can be towards specific genres. For me, it's anything not academic, which is usually the reverse of a lot of people, but I would much rather write like a formal essay than write a poem, because I struggle with that a lot. Any other thoughts, questions, strategies you would add to this thing?
You should add your information about the meeting tomorrow, because it's really good information.
Dr. Spencer Kagan talks a lot about brain-friendly teaching strategies, and so he's a good one to look up. He's a lot of fun to read, and it seems so silly, and I went in so skeptical, and I came out like I actually feel good about that. Like I was giggling the whole time. And those conversation starters work wonders in my class when it came to just getting two students to talk, even two students who didn't hang out. I tell them, I don't care who your friends are outside of, I mean, I care, but I don't care who your friends are outside of this class. In this classroom, we all interact with one another, even if that's just, hi, what's good, partner, and then get to work. That's what I need from you, and it did build a lot of